All right, it's been kind of a long time since I reviewed a video game. Not that I haven't enjoyed any or played any, I just got caught up in the muck of life, I guess. The end of 2023 was actually really terrible. But today I'm going to talk about Palworld because setting aside the controversy, of which there is plenty, by the way, like a new data mined creature that was just discovered, which is basically Mewtwo. Setting all that aside, the game is actually really fun, hits at the perfect time, respects the audience in a way that isn't exactly common anymore in the video game industry, and I've played enough of it now to give an actual take on whether or not it's worth buying. I will not be discussing the copyright situation or the AI accusations or anything of a similar nature. I've talked about all that previously in its own video, and it's a fairly divisive topic, so to clarify, this review is only about gameplay, mechanics, enjoyment, monetization, etc., etc. This is the good, the bad, and the ugly of Palworld as its own product, so without further ado, let's dive in. Open world survival element crafting where you capture unique monsters. That's the basic format, really. Picture the technology tree from Ark Survival Evolved in a vaguely Valheim-esque open world with some action combat and sprinkle in gameplay elements from Zelda Breath of the Wild. Palworld is really just an amalgamation of like 6 different popular franchises right now simultaneously, drawing from each of them in a way where it feels distinctly familiar, but also holding its own with enough of those inspirations to where things can still, surprisingly, be somewhat unexpected. I struggled for a good long while on how to break this down, but I settled on 3 different categories: leveling, combat, base building, and crafting. Combined, these 3 areas encompass the lion's share of what you'll experience in the game, and I'll probably leave a few things out here and there, but for the most part, it'll cover the important aspects of what makes this game fun, successful, and, at times, very annoying. Let's begin with leveling, the basic experience, if you will. There is a right and a wrong way to play this game. I figured that out because for a number of hours I was playing it distinctly wrong, but when you understand the framework it's based on, things go a lot smoother. You effectively level up from basically everything. Capture a pal with a sphere, gain experience. Craft something, gain experience. Kill something, same deal, etc., etc. But with a max level of 50, and that level being pretty much necessary for some of the endgame content as a result of the level gating damage system, the balancing of said experience gain is actually incredibly important. The game really isn't shy about telling you how you're supposed to play, but early on, I wasn't exactly aware of just how restrictive that ends up being, or rather, inversely, if you want to look at it this way, rewarding that ends up being for a certain playstyle. See, right off the bat, it tells you catch 10 pals for an experience boost. But what it doesn't tell you is that that's not a flat experience boost at the end. Catching those pals, 10 of each type, provides infinitely scaling linear bonuses to where you'll be catching level 4 or 5 monsters eventually and getting 12,000 experience. Big shout out to the friends I played alongside here for making this clear to me, but if you play the game catching 1 or 2 monsters of each type in a very casual way, you will plateau and find it incredibly hard to level your character without returning to low level zones and grinding them for an extended period of time. If you play in a style where you catch everything you see every time rather than kill it, and maximize at least 10 of each type whenever possible, you will accelerate through the levels much more comfortably and probably have a better overall experience without having to backtrack. The game is about collecting creatures, to be fair, so I don't necessarily mark this as a huge negative against it, but when you play Palworld, you should know that without focusing on the capture mechanic and specifically 10 of each type you see whenever possible, you would be ignoring the fundamental progression curve in a way that slows leveling down to a very slow crawl in the late 30s and early 40s. That being said, there's a tremendous amount of stuff to do in the world, keeping things relatively fresh. You can fight open world alphas, souped up versions of regular pals that you normally encounter. You can delve into dungeons, or caves as some people call them, which are supposedly procedural generation, but ended up being super, super predictable. If you see a branching pathway, the one with the water on the right hand side and the rock hallway on the left, always take the water on the right hand side because the tile set is 100% predictable and spawns the same way every single time. And you can stack your team for one of the tower bosses if you want to, which are kind of like the capstone for each region. There's 43 alphas out in the world that we know of, 5 different boss towers, and these are spread across 4 different separate biomes with distinct mechanical differences: hot, cold, neutral, etc., where you take damage if you're too hot or too cold, yada yada. Exploring is fun. It's interesting to discover new pals, tame them, fight with them, discover what they do at the base. I'll discuss that later on, and collect items or chests. But as I said earlier, if you aren't focusing on the capture mechanic in particular, you may feel a sort of plateau effect and be pushed back into the starter zones to just spam capture low level monsters over and over. And some people might not care, but I did care, so I thought I'd mention it. Next up is combat. A lot of people describe this as Pokemon with guns, and that's a very fair description to make. You'll be capturing pals that have 9 different ability types, assembling them into various different teams and bringing them to fight against open world alphas, bosses, or base raids. But the real fun to be had is with the unique ability of each pal. Some of them can become rideable rocket launching platforms. Others have passive abilities that enhance your damage. But the point is to experiment with the captured pals you have and play off of what they do to spice up the combat. For the player in particular, combat is extremely simplistic. Get a weapon, repeatedly hit something. If it's low, hit it with a capture sphere. That's it. That's the whole loop. You can get better and better guns or craft better armor and gadgets, kind of, some gadgets. But the diversity of combat mechanics is solely focused on your PAL team. With that said, archetypes very much matter. The combat leaves a bit to be desired if you're trying to play this as like a third person shooter yourself, but it really isn't supposed to be a third person shooter as its base gameplay. Its foundation is a team building simulator. The level gating restrictions are way too severe, in my opinion. You are actively penalized for fighting things that are too far above you or your level in a way that doesn't feel super comfortable to me. But once you start to assemble the right squad, you'll see a dramatic difference in performance. If you have a team of pals with the proper element which your enemy is weak against, whatever that may be for their type, it is dramatically different than having the wrong type and seeing diminished results. That kind of planning, the necessity of leveling different types for different purposes, and the ultimate effect they end up having is sometimes easy to ignore if you're trying to just accelerate through the game, but extremely satisfying when done properly. All in all, it's a pretty good system. The bosses, however, leave a lot to be desired. This feeds into a sort of badly optimized gameplay loop with the crafting, but the boss towers house enemies that have way more health than the open world types. You're on a 10-minute timer every time, and you need to do enough damage in that time frame to kill them, making the level gated damage multipliers, which are very obvious in some cases, that much more obnoxious when you happen to be just outside of the threshold. That being said, proper planning, resource management, the right team, it all ends up working well together and rewarding players who think of everything. Now, the bridge between combat, generally speaking, and base building slash crafting is base raids. These are stupid. Base raids are one of the worst features in Palworld, not because of their necessary difficulty, but because the implementation is absolute garbage. Periodically, you will get raided. Pretty normal in a lot of games, nothing to see here. Half the time, it's a hilariously easy set of weak enemies, joke enemies, that serve no purpose other than to make you go outside and shoot them one time. The other half of the times, it's a large number of dangerous ones, which might sound good, but most of the time, at least in my experience, they glitch out completely. They run around and then disappear. They run face first into a wall constantly. They spaz out and teleport randomly, sometimes into the sky. Or they just do a loop and go back home, never really doing anything else. It's hard to explain just how broken the base rating mechanic seems to actually be. And it's a small complaint in the grand scheme of things, yeah, but with how botched it is right now, I genuinely recommend you just turn it off in the world menu. The game is straight up better as a result. What's also coincidentally better if you do this is the general base mechanics themselves. See, every PAL can be a worker, and every worker has a different set of skills. Without going too deep here, you can have pals that water and grow crops, or craft items, or mine resources and kindle fires. The set of traits that they possess and the particular skills that each one carries make them well suited, or ill suited sometimes, to particular jobs, and managing what pals are where and how efficient your base can be is extremely fun when you get into it. High level pals produce high level materials that would otherwise be a real pain point to get when you put them at the ranch, that is. And positioning everything for optimal workflow is like an entire game by itself when they don't glitch out and go stand in random places or hurt themselves and have to take long breaks all the time. Yeah, some people are upset over the ethics of it all, I guess, because they are effectively slave labor if you want them to be. But it's a video game, and these are fictionalized pixel creatures who make fantasy items, so you can get over it. The base building itself, as in walls, floors, ceilings, stairs, etc., is pretty shit, to be honest. It's very shallow, very poorly constructed, and leaves a lot to be desired compared to practically any other game where base building exists at all. But it gets the job done. One thing I have to say here, build your base on the iron deposits. There's a number of spots throughout the entire map where iron spawns in a big cluster, or metal or ore spawns. I mean, it's iron, let's just be real. But having your base built at that location where a bunch of them spawn in a cluster is critical to a smooth experience. You can farm it elsewhere if you want to. There's a few locations that serve the purpose, generally speaking. But with how skewed the entire crafting system actually is towards metal, then refined metal, then pal metal, with the sheer number of consumables and items that require metal in large numbers as well, yeah, you're going to be significantly better off having immediate access to ore instead of having to go somewhere else to get it. Now, as fun as this game is, and I have been playing it quite a lot because it is fun, this is where I have to criticize it. The balancing on this crafting loop is pretty terrible. The speed at which you consume spheres and ammunition, combined with the sheer volume of metal you need to craft them, at the high levels at least, make it way too grindy in one of the worst possible ways for a decent chunk of your time. Yes, you can overcome this by having one base at the metal and one base at the coal, and you constantly go and teleport between them with the right pals and your crafting tables at each one, but the values here leave a lot to be desired, and towards the end of my playtime, it started to make a lot more sense why they include so many different sliders and options in the world settings. I actually advise people to take advantage of those, in moderation at least, to avoid some of the problems that appear in the late 30s and early 40s, but to each their own. You don't necessarily have to. Ultimately, it's a fun experience. It's flashy, colorful, has some deep crafting mechanics, and solid combat, with an enormous open world. But that open world can sometimes feel a bit sparsely populated, and the crafting, the base raids, the boss fights feel a bit rough around the edges, at least with their numerical balancing. With that said, it's a $26 game with no microtransactions. It appeals to a demographic who have been largely ignored or sold flat out garbage for the past few years, Pokemon fans. And it does so with passion. Palworld is fun. Yes, it has quirks. Yes, there are bugs, a lot of them. Yes, the game has issues that can be criticized. But I find myself looking past all of that and kind of just appreciating what they made. Again, this video deliberately avoids the topic of plagiarism or theft, etc., but if we look at the game for what it is in a vacuum, it's undeniably fun to play. The audio can be buggy and sometimes just flat out strange for that matter. The combat AI can be really hit or miss. The bosses can glitch out more than I would normally like to see in a game, but again, the game somehow manages to make you effortlessly look past all of its major flaws, or nearly all of its major flaws, somehow maintaining excitement to explore, discover new enemies, and optimize your base. If I had to give it a number, I'd say 7 or 8 out of 10, but I'd say that with a relatively warm undertone here, because this is an early access title for a fair price with enormous success, making me believe that it's highly likely to continue receiving major content updates in the future. They have PvP on the roadmap, among other things, which is always good for me to see, in my personal opinion, which turns this from a one-off experience to a title in your library you very likely may come back to. For me, it's a good game with a good score because it made mostly good decisions. That's it. If you want to support the channel, there are links down below, Patreon and Locals primarily, plus other stuff like a VPN affiliate if you want one of those and also want to support at the same time, or a security extension for Chrome, a good one that we have a partnership with, etc., etc. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.